Hi there. When we're looking at organisational culture, particularly in the context of multinational businesses, it's important to consider the different cultures that exist around the world. And the theorist who came up with a model of this was Geert Hofstede and his theory of national cultures. So let's take a quick look at what his model said. There he is, there's Geert Hofstede, a social psychologist, and he conducted his initial piece of research at IBM, one of the world's first genuinely global operating multinational businesses. He looked at the activities, the work ethics and attitudes of over 100,000 employees working for IBM around the world and tried to categorise his finding in terms of different cultures of the different nations where IBM was operating. And he has since expanded this research to come up with 6 categories that help define national cultures. So let's have a look at the 6. They're listed there. I'm going to take you through each for 30 seconds or so. The key thing if you're studying this model is just to be aware of what the 6 are and how they differ, and potentially to make a link between some of them and other aspects of the course. Let's start with individualism versus collectivism. Here the issue is that some societies absolutely value the role and performance of individuals over the team, whereas in other societies, other cultures, teamwork, the importance of team is more important than the individual. And of course this has significant implications for how employees are rewarded. Do you give them financial bonuses, for example commissions, based on how they perform as individuals, or do you set financial rewards up to improve motivation based around team performance? So you can see how a different cultural attitude to team versus individual influences areas like motivational strategy. The second category, and perhaps the most famous category from Hofstede's research, was what he calls the power distance. This is all about the extent to which a culture recognises, encourages either authority and what goes with that, bureaucracy, tall organisational hierarchies, a command and control approach perhaps, compared with a low PD score where the culture would very much encourage flatter organisational structures, a much greater emphasis on delegation, on empowerment, and autonomy. Perhaps also you might make a link there to decentralised structures, which are also consistent with cultures with a low power distance. The third of Hofstede's categories is what he called masculinity versus femininity, a slightly unfortunately named category. It's really not about male against females, it's more about the differences in decision-making style between different cultures. Hofstede described what he called a masculine approach to decision-making, fact-based, hard-edged, aggressive, comparing that with what he described as what he called a feminine decision-making style, which involves a good deal more consultation, perhaps a greater emphasis on hunch rather than science and data, and a much less aggressive approach to making decisions. So masculinity versus femininity is really all about the style of decision making in an organisation in different national cultures. The fourth one, Hofstede called uncertainty avoidance. And here this is really all about attitude to risk. How anxious do managers feel at work, do employees feel at work when they're put in a situation of making decisions? What is their attitude of risk, and to what extent do they try to avoid risk and the consequences of getting things wrong? So your low levels of uncertainty avoidance on Hofstede's index would indicate a willingness to accept more risks. We're not too concerned about avoiding uncertainty. Bring it on. Let's embrace risk. Let's embrace change. Perhaps that's suggestive of a more entrepreneurial approach in those countries, compared with high levels of uncertainty avoidance, which would suggest a potentially less entrepreneurial approach, perhaps structures that emphasise the need for more certainty, less risk-taking. Long-term orientation was Hofstede's fifth category, and this is all about how far you look ahead. What's your perspective, your time horizon when making business decisions? In some countries, management teams, businesses are run on a very short-termist basis. They're focused on next week's sales, this quarter's profits. Has the share price gone up or down today, this week? And often financial rewards are based on short-term performance. The salesman who's paid, or she's paid, a commission based on this month's sales, beating next quarter's targets and what have you. Hofstede found that in some countries, and this is still the case, there's much more of a long-term perspective that's taken. And therefore rewards tend to be more geared around long-term performance. A key link to make between long-term, short-term orientation is with investment appraisal. So if you get a question on investment appraisal, and maybe there's an opportunity to explore the different cultures that might be relevant to the decisions that are being considered, think about whether the culture is more likely to emphasise short-term requirements, short-term returns, or whether in fact the business is able to take a more long-term perspective on possible returns from investment. And lastly, but not leastly, indulgence versus restraint. And here Hofstede identified two different, well, it's a scale, but societies which embrace indulgence generally allow a relatively free gratification of human fun, enjoying life, having fun, expressing yourself fairly freely. Whereas some societies, of course, are more restrained by their nature. Therefore, he identified a difference there. And if you look at Hofstede's work, you don't need to know any of this detail, but on the Hofstede Centre website, there is some data on the relative scores for different countries between the 6 culture indicators. And it's interesting to pick out one or two in terms of their relatively high score compared with others. South Korea, seen to take a very long-term orientation towards the time horizon, the planning for business decision making. China has a very low level of indulgence, much more likely to want to take a restraint approach. The USA, very much an individualistic culture compared with an emphasis on team. But as I say, you don't need to know that detail, but it's interesting in terms of how different countries and therefore different cultures are defined by Hofstede's culture indicators. And I think that's the key application of the model. Other than just a multiple choice question that tests whether you can recognise the 6 different categories, it's how you might bring it into an answer and relate it in particular to the challenges faced by multinationals as they're trying to do business around the world. Because the reality is that even though a multinational might be the same or appear the same wherever you are in the world, they're trying to operate in different national cultures. So there we go, Hofstede's national cultures summarised in 5 or 6 minutes. Hopefully that's useful.